Alright, let's talk about one of the most revolutionary writers of the 20th century, James Joyce. Joyce was born on February 2nd, 1882 in Avant-Garde, a suburb of Dublin, into a middle-class Catholic family, and that detail has been asked in exam. His father's fortunes declined over time, forcing the family to move to North Dublin, and these early experiences of financial struggle and shifting identity shaped much of Joyce's later writing. He was educated in Jesuit schools, where he developed an early fascination with philosophy, religion, and language. Though raised Catholic, Joyce grew skeptical of the Church's control over Irish life, a conflict that runs through nearly all of his work. In 1902, he moved to Paris with the idea of studying medicine, but literature soon took over his life. After returning briefly to Dublin in 1903, he met Nora Barnacle, the woman who would become his lifelong partner. And yes, that meeting with Nora is another favorite exam question. The couple eventually left Ireland in 1905 and lived abroad for most of their lives in Italy, Switzerland, and Paris before returning to Zurich, where Joyce died in 1941. Now, Joyce's early work shows his artistic growth step by step. His first publication, Chamber Music in 1907, is a collection of lyrical poems, delicate, musical, and romantic. But his real breakthrough came with Dubliners, published in 1914 after years of rejection and censorship. The book's realistic portrayal of Dublin life was considered risky for its time, and publication was delayed due to libel concerns that too has been asked in exam. The stories in Dubliners are snapshots of paralysis, ordinary people trapped by social, moral, and religious constraints. Many of the characters were inspired by real Dubliners Joyce knew. Then came A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in 1916, another important exam title. It follows Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's alter ego, from childhood through rebellion against family, church, and nation, until he declares his mission to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. Joyce continued Stephen's journey in Ulysses, 1922, his most famous and controversial work. Set in Dublin over a single day, June 16, 1904, the novel reimagines Homer's Odyssey in modern life. Its experimental technique, especially the stream of consciousness style, transformed the modern novel. That technique, by the way, is a direct exam question. Then, in 1939, Joyce published Finnegans Wake, a dreamlike, multi-layered text that pushes language itself to its limits. It took him 17 years to complete and remains one of the most complex books ever written in English. He also experimented in other forms, his only play, Exile's 1918, and several volumes of poetry, including Poems Pennage, 1927, and Collected Poems, 1936. Now, beyond the books, Joyce's writing is deeply tied to Irish history and politics. He grew up during Ireland's struggle for independence from Britain, a period shaped by figures like Charles Stuart Parnell, the uncrowned King of Ireland. Parnell's downfall after his affair with Kitty O'Shea Joyce was just 9 when it happened, haunted Irish politics and divided the nation. That tension between idealism, religion, and betrayal echoes throughout Joyce's fiction. Even though Joyce lived most of his life abroad, his imagination never left Dublin. Every novel, every short story, and even his poetry circle back to Ireland, its voices, its streets, its ghosts. Let's talk about James Joyce's Dubliners, a landmark short story collection written between 1904 and 1907 and finally published in 1914 after years of rejection and censorship. That publication year has been asked in exam, so make sure to note it. The collection captures everyday life in Dublin with stunning realism and emotional precision. Joyce originally planned 3 stories about Stephen Dedalus, which later inspired A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. That's another key exam fact. Now, Dubliners is beautifully structured. The first 3 stories are narrated in the first person and center on childhood's simple moments filled with quiet revelation. The next 4 stories focus on young adulthood, told in the third person, exploring love, paralysis, and moral struggle. The following 4 stories portray mature, middle-aged life, filled with compromise, regret, and disillusionment. Then come 3 stories on broader themes like politics, art, and religion. And finally, we reach The Dead, the closing story considered a world masterpiece and often called the finest short story ever written in English. It brings all of Joyce's themes together: memory, loss, identity, and the haunting stillness of life in Dublin. Next, we have A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, published in 1916. This book marks the true beginning of literary modernism, and it's one of the most frequently asked texts in exams. Now, what kind of novel is it? It's what we call a Künstlerroman, meaning a story about an artist's growth and self-discovery. Here, that artist is Stephen Dedalus, whose very surname is symbolic. It comes from Daedalus, the mythic Greek craftsman who built the labyrinth and escaped it with wings of his own making. Joyce uses that myth to represent Stephen's longing for artistic and spiritual freedom. The novel is deeply personal, it's semi-autobiographical, mirroring Joyce's own experiences growing up in late 19th century Ireland. But the style is what really changed literature forever. Joyce abandons strict realism and uses a new technique, free indirect speech, so that we move fluidly in and out of Stephen's consciousness. Interestingly, Joyce didn't start with this version. The book actually began as a massive 63-chapter draft called Stephen Hero. That title has been asked in exam, but Joyce condensed it into the 5-chapter masterpiece we now know as A Portrait of the Artist. Let's look at the story. It opens with one of the most famous lines in modern fiction. Once upon a time, and a very good time, there was a muko coming down along the road. That childish rhythm immediately pulls us into Stephen's early memory, full of sound, rhythm, and confusion. It's Joyce's way of showing how language itself grows with the child. Stephen's early years are marked by Catholic schooling at Clongowes Wood College, another point often tested in exam, where he's punished unfairly for breaking his glasses. That moment is crucial. It's the first time Stephen questions authority and injustice. At home, his family life is strained. Political tensions, especially over Charles Stuart Parnell's death, explode at the dinner table, symbolizing Ireland's divided identity. His father's financial troubles worsen, and the family sinks into poverty, forcing Stephen to leave Clongowes. Later, at Belvedere College, Stephen excels in academics and writing, but his moral life begins to crumble. He falls into sin, visiting a prostitute, and experiences lust, shame, and guilt, all of which he confesses in painful detail. Soon after, the school conducts fiery sermons on sin, punishment, and the 4 last things: death, judgment, hell, and heaven. Another detail often asked in exam, the imagery of eternal torment shakes Stephen so deeply that he repents and embraces piety, even considering the priesthood. But then comes a turning point. Walking along Dollymount Strand, Stephen sees a young girl wading in the water, her image radiant and pure, and he has a sudden epiphany. He realizes that beauty, sensuality, and art are not sinful but sacred in their own right. This is his awakening, his liberation. That bird girl scene is one of the defining moments of modernist literature, and yes, it's been asked in exam. From this moment, Stephen vows to reject all constraints, family, religion, and nation, and to live life to the fullest through art. He joins university, debates, philosophy with friends like Cranley, another name that often appears in exam questions, and articulates his theory of the artist, detached, independent, and devoted to truth. By the end, Stephen embraces his destiny as an artist. He decides to leave Ireland, to exile himself from the narrow world that holds him back. Like Daedalus, he'll fly free, forging his own path. The novel ends with Stephen's journal entries, where he writes his famous line, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." That sentence alone captures the heart of Joyce's vision, an artist creating not just for himself, but for an entire culture. And don't forget, the novel was serialized by Ezra Pound in The Egoist magazine, another exam favorite detail before being published in New York by B.W. Hirsch in 1916. Alright, let's dive into one of the most influential and honestly one of the most challenging novels of the 20th century, James Joyce's Ulysses. This book is often called a demonstration and summation of modernism, and yes, that phrase has been asked in exam. It was serialized in the Little Review between 1918 and 1920 and then published in Paris in 1922 by Sylvia Beach, the owner of the famous Shakespeare and Company bookstore. That Paris publication date 1922 is absolutely essential to remember for exam. Now, what is Ulysses about? On the surface, it's deceptively simple. The entire story takes place in Dublin on a single day, June 16th, 1904, following the lives of three main characters, Leopold Bloom, his wife Molly Bloom, and Stephen Dedalus, who is a kind of younger version of Joyce himself. That date, June 16th, has become legendary. Readers all over the world still celebrate it as Bloomsday every year, and yes, that too has been asked in exam. But here's the genius part. The novel is structured around Homer's Odyssey. Joyce reimagines the Greek hero Ulysses or Odysseus as the ordinary Dublin man, Leopold Bloom, wandering through the city instead of the Mediterranean. His wife Molly becomes a modern-day Penelope, and Stephen Dedalus represents Telemachus, Odysseus' son, a young man searching for meaning, knowledge, and father figures. The novel has three main parts, modeled after Homer's journey. Part 1, Telemachia, focusing on Stephen Dedalus. Part 2, The Odyssey, following Bloom's wanderings. Part 3, Nostos, meaning homecoming, where Bloom and Stephen's paths finally intersect. Together, these parts make up 18 episodes, each written in a different style, and yes, both the structure and number of episodes have been asked in exam. Joyce uses stream of consciousness, interior monologue, and experimental prose techniques that dive straight into the characters' minds. Instead of traditional narration, we get thoughts, memories, and sensations flowing freely, sometimes without punctuation, just like real thinking. Let's walk quickly through a few of the key episodes, because these titles and themes are exam favorites. Telemachus opens the novel with Stephen's morning quarrel with Buck Mulligan at the Martello Tower. It mirrors Telemachus's restlessness in the Odyssey. Calypso shifts focus to Bloom, making breakfast for his wife, Molly, while quietly suspecting her affair with Hugh Blazes Boylan. Proteus shows Stephen walking along the beach, lost in deep philosophical thoughts about perception and existence. In Hades, Bloom attends Paddy Digname's funeral, a dark symbolic journey into mortality and memory. Sirens is a musical episode written like a fugue. Joyce turns language into rhythm and sound as Bloom overhears Boylan's flirtations. Cyclops features Bloom facing xenophobia and anti-Semitism in a Dublin pub, one of the most politically charged episodes. CSE throws us into a surreal, hallucinatory world inside a brothel full of nightmarish transformations and repressed desires. And finally, Penelope gives us Molly Bloom's soliloquy, one of the most famous endings in literature. It's a long, unpunctuated stream of thought, intimate, sensual, and deeply human. It ends with the unforgettable line, "Yes, I said, yes, I will." Yes, that closing line has been quoted endlessly, and yes, it's been asked in exam. Thematically, Ulysses explores identity, guilt, adultery, alienation, and the search for meaning in modern life. It's both deeply Irish and profoundly universal. The city of Dublin itself becomes a living character full of smells, voices, and memories as Joyce compresses all of life into one ordinary day. But Ulysses wasn't always celebrated. It caused outrage for its frankness about sex and the human body, leading to an obscenity trial in 1921 in the United States. Ironically, that controversy helped make it famous. Alright, let's take a deep breath because we're diving into one of the most challenging and fascinating works in all of English literature, James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. Now, this was Joyce's final novel, published in 1939 after 17 years of writing in Paris, and that date has been asked in exam. Joyce himself called it a work of fiction with deconstruction, which captures its experimental, dreamlike structure perfectly. So, what makes this novel so unique and so difficult? Well, Joyce wrote it in a completely idiosyncratic language, a dense web of English, Latin, French, Irish, and even made-up words. It's full of puns, wordplay, and hidden meanings, all stitched together to mimic the logic, or rather, the illogic of dreams. He famously said, "Every syllable can be justified." That line itself has been asked in exam. Structurally, Finnegans Wake defies all traditional storytelling. There's no clear beginning, middle, or end. Instead, the novel loops endlessly a cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Its final line ends mid-sentence with the word "the," and that sentence is completed by the novel's opening words. So, if you read it in a circle, it never really stops. That cyclical structure and that one-word ending, "the," both have been asked in exam. At the center of this swirling dream is H.C.E. Humphrey Chimden Earwicker, who stands for Everyman, a symbol of universal humanity. He is an innkeeper in Dublin, and his initials H.C.E. also repeat in countless variations throughout the text. He represents both the rise and fall of mankind. His symbolic fall comes after he is accused of indecency, though the crime is never clearly explained, another key exam detail. H.C.E.'s wife, Anna Livia Pluribel, represents water, rivers, and the eternal feminine. Her initials ALP echo through the novel, and she even writes a letter defending H.C.E.'s reputation. The letter, often unreadable, becomes a symbol of human misunderstanding. That's another important fact. ALP's letter has been asked in exam. Their twin sons, Shem and Sean, represent opposing forces, the artistic and the practical, the rebellious and the obedient. Together they stand for the eternal tension between creation and order. The title itself, Finnegans Wake, comes from an Irish folk ballad about Tim Finnegan, a bricklayer who falls to his death only to be revived when whiskey is spilled on him during his wake. The story becomes a metaphor for human resurrection, and yes, that connection to Irish folklore has been directly asked in exam. The whole book unfolds like a long, fragmented dream, as if we're drifting through H.C.E.'s subconscious. Time in this world isn't linear, it's cyclical, repeating endlessly, just like life itself. The last scene sees ALP merging with the river, flowing into the sea, and beginning the cycle, again symbolizing rebirth and continuity. And the novel's final line, "Away, alone, a last, a loved," captures this eternal movement toward dissolution and return. That haunting final line has been asked in exam too, so make sure you remember it. Even though it's famously unreadable for most readers, Finnegans Wake had a massive influence on modern and postmodern writers. It inspired new ways of thinking about language, consciousness, and the very limits of fiction. So, to wrap it up, Finnegans Wake is a dream of humanity, written in a language of its own. Its themes, the fall, renewal, and endless cycles of life. Its main figures, H.C.E., ALP, Shem, and Sean. Its form, circular, multilingual, and deeply symbolic. And yes, it ends with "the," only to begin again. As Joyce himself said, every syllable can be justified. Maybe that's the best way to understand Finnegans Wake, not as a story to follow, but as a dream to experience.